As the story goes, by 1900-1901, the naval gunnery range was increasing dramatically. For example, in the time when Cesarewitch was designed, 1895-1896, the accepted naval gunnery range was around 2,000 to 3,000 yards, let's say 3 kilometers. By 1900-1901, the target practice was conducted to around 3 to 5 kilometers already. In the Battle of Yellow Sea, in the summer of 1904, the Japanese opened fire on the Russians at 13 kilometers. 13 kilometers. And they started to place hits on Redvitsan, on the Russian battleship, between 10 and 12 kilometers. Redvitsan got hit 12 times between 10 and 12 kilometers. And the Russians also opened fire on the Japanese, and they started to place hits on the Mikasa from a very long range, unheard of. So the navies and the crews and the admirals and everybody was they were starting to be aware of the possibility that you can open fire on your enemy from a much longer ranges than previously thought. Instead of 5 kilometers, you could open fire at 8 or 10 or 12 kilometers. Of course, at these long ranges beyond 5 kilometers, the smaller guns, the 6 inches guns or the 7.5 inches guns, they were not quite as interesting as they were at less than 5 kilometers. They were not having much hitting power anymore. Their effective range was decreasing very rapidly. And their accuracy and the splash spotting, the shell spotting was very difficult for these small shells at very long range. So it was first the British, they considered adding heavier guns for the secondary battery. And these guns were the 9.2 inches Mark 10. They added them in the King Edward VII class. They added 4 of them in individual turrets, and those battleships become more powerful than whatever was building before them. So the King Edward class was having 8 battleships, and then they built another 3 next year, and they ended up being 11 of them, these pre-dreadnoughts. Some people consider them semi-dreadnoughts, and they quickly became the spine of the central point of the Royal Navy in those times, just before the launching of the dreadnought itself. This trend with 9.2 inch guns continued with London class and Duncan class, and then finally with the two ships of Lord Nelson. And Lord Nelson was having 4 turrets, 4 double mount turrets, and another 2 single mount turrets, 9.2 inches. And this was a very powerful secondary battery. These 9.2 inches in Lord Nelson were 9.2 Mark 11. And there were some differences between Mark 10 and Mark 11, which we'll discuss perhaps when we'll install or when we'll assemble the turrets and so on. All this to say one thing. As the Battle of Yellow Sea and later the Battle of Tsushima showed, the heavy guns were not quite capable of penetrating the armor belt of the battleships, of the opposing battleships, but they were doing a lot of damage in the superstructure and in areas not armored, not properly armored. If the enemy battleship like Cesarewitch was hit repeatedly in the superstructure, you remember from my build of Cesarewitch when I showed the pictures of Cesarewitch in Tsingtao, the superstructure was quite devastated with heavy loss of life and so on. And while the battleship was not quite incapacitated, was not sunk, it was impossible for it to function properly, so it had to be retreated from the fleet. The same can be said about shell penetration in the upper part of the hulls, which was not armored. It was theoretically it was way above the waterline, so no need to armor that part. But because, let's say, the Borodino class, they were so overweight that the waterline was higher, and when the Japanese shells started to penetrate that area in the Battle of Tsushima, those battleships got a lot of flooding and lost their buoyancy, and some of them got upside down and exploded and whatever happened. So the thing is, you don't need too much firepower to make a lot of damage on a battleship in those times. You didn't need a lot of 12 inches guns. You could obtain an equivalent result with a small number of 12 inches, like 4 12 inches, and a lot of 9.2 or even 10 or even 8 inches guns, like the Japanese in the Battle of Tsushima. So this is why the Navy is focused on having more guns in the secondary battery, but heavier guns, to be able to inflict a lot of damage in superstructure and in unarmored areas of the enemy ships from a very long range. And these 9.2 inches guns were quite the tool to do that. They were quite devastating when they landed on the decks, on the boats, on the funnels, on unarmored areas of the enemy ship. In the first part of this episode, I said something like, you don't need many 12 inches guns to create a lot of damage on the decks, on the funnels, on the boats, on the enemy superstructure, and to render the enemy incapable of continuing the fight. The 9.2 inches guns would do the job just fine. From this idea, we have two other ideas, one more interesting than the other. The first following idea is this. These two ships, the Lord Nelson and Agamemnon, were sent to the Dardanelles in the eastern Mediterranean Sea, to the Straits, and they were having two missions. One mission was to keep bombarding the Turkish forts and the Turkish army position on the shores, and more important, the second role was to bottle up the battle cruiser Goeben, the German Goeben, which was in Constantinople at the time, and it was fighting on the German side, of course, with the Turks, and against the British. So Agamemnon and Lord Nelson were sent there to bottle up the straits and to act against the Goeben if ever the Goeben would have tried to get out of the straits and into the Mediterranean. This tells you that in the minds of the admirals, in the minds of the Royal Navy establishment, these two ships were perfectly able to take on the Goeben. Now these were pre-dreadnoughts. Well, they were semi-dreadnoughts, but they were not dreadnoughts. Goeben, however, was one of the best German battle cruisers, and it was a dreadnought. It was not a dreadnought battleship, it was a dreadnought battle cruiser, but it was having all the dreadnought characteristics, traits. It was walking like a dreadnought, talking like a dreadnought, looking like a dreadnought. It was a dreadnought. Okay. Still, these two ships, with their multitude of 9.2 inches guns, they were considered quite enough, quite apt, quite capable to take on that dreadnought battle cruiser Goeben. And this was a very, very interesting idea. Maybe we should look at the map and see, perhaps, how a battle like this would have happened. But I think that exercise is too long and it exceeds the scope of this episode. The second idea, which is even more interesting, is how would these Lord Nelson's semi-dreadnoughts would have compared to the dreadnought itself. Remember, the dreadnought itself was having 12 inches guns, while these ships were having only 4 12 inches, but they were having a lot of other heavy guns, 9.2 inches guns. So they would have been able, perhaps, to inflict a lot of damage on the dreadnoughts, even ship to ship, a lot of damage on the dreadnought superstructure and on the decks that would have incapacitated, perhaps, the dreadnought as to not continue fighting. It's an interesting idea. Now you have to look at the armor scheme of these ships compared to the dreadnought and see that the main belt of these ships would be the same or even thicker than what the dreadnought mounted. And so on. There are subtle differences that tell me that one Lord Nelson would have stood a good chance, maybe not of sinking the dreadnought, but inflicting such a damage on the dreadnought as to get it out of the way. Interesting idea. What a combination of these two ships, a small squadron, would have done to dreadnought is anybody's guess. These two ships put together would have been perhaps superior to the dreadnought herself. These are very interesting ideas indeed. So this gives you an idea of how these ships compared and what their place was between normal pre-dreadnoughts and the dreadnought, where they were placed into the natural evolution of the fighting power, firepower, number and caliber of guns between the, let's say, the majestic or formidable class and passing through the King Edward class, through these ships, Lord Nelson, and going towards the dreadnought. What was their place in the general scheme of things? What was their place in the overall game? And what was their place in the Royal Navy at those times? These ships were, for their time and for their intended missions, very powerful players. Now let's perhaps make a quick tour of the ship and see some of the details and have some of the comments for some punctual local details very shortly. Starting from the prow, what intrigues me is the number of anchor ports and the number of anchors, because I have this picture showing one of the ships, I don't know which one, Lord Nelson or Agamemnon, showing it with 2 ports and only 1 anchor installed, and the empty port is hosting an anchor chain from one side to another. And then I have another picture with only 1 port and 1 anchor. But this is a model. This is not a picture of the real ship. But wait. We have the combrig instructions with 2 ports and 2 anchors on each side, which would be something that very much resembles the previous class of King Edward semi-dreadnoughts. Then we have another one with 1 anchor, one port and no anchor installed. This would be the Agamemnon, as the picture says. Excuse me, one port, 1 anchor. And then another model in great detail where I have 1 anchor port and no anchor at all. I don't know how somebody put a lot of work and detailing for the rigging and aerials, and they didn't install the anchor in this ship. I don't know. It's not. I don't criticize this. I'm just wondering. So this is the first mystery: the number of ports and the number of anchors in this ship. Our model shows 1 port and 1 anchor, so very much resembles the Agamemnon that we've seen in the previous picture. Okay, let's go back to the reference picture and let's try to navigate towards the middle of the ship. First of all, I'm having this different picture from the rear of the ship, and this one shows us a very flush deck from one end to another with the turrets on the deck and with the island in the middle. And that island is kinda occupy perhaps 1/3 of the length of the ship. And around that island you have the turrets, and on the island you have the small guns, the 3 inches anti-torpedo boat guns, and you have the boats, and you have platforms, and you have the flying bridge, and you have perhaps the conning tower and the upper bridges, and even the masts are installed within that island. Interesting concept. Now, speaking about the masts, the first mast is the single straight mast, alright? But the second one is a tripod. So I wonder why the second one Is it actually a tripod? I'm not sure anymore. It seems to have a lateral support towards the end of the ship. It's different from the first one. Why were these masts different? I wonder. Then we have the boats. And we have a picture actually with a strange, very strange boat support. That's a picture from reality. I don't see that kind of support in the model here. And how about the turrets? Yeah, the turrets are not round anymore. The turrets are the lateral faces of the turrets are in angles, and straight faces, but in angles. Okay, and the roofs are sloped. Interesting concept. Already the roofs are sloped. Keep in mind that these turrets, these 12 inches turrets, together with exactly the same 12 inches guns, they were installed in the dreadnought, I mean similar turrets. For the secondary turrets, the 9.2 inches, I can see pretty much the same shape, but smaller turrets. And there is again this picture that shows us the at rest position 0 for the middle turret, for the middle single mount turret. Apart from that, we have this Admiral Bridge at the end of the ship, which is something special. And I cannot escape the dread of having to deal with the rigging for this one. Would be very interesting. I'm not sure what I'm gonna do for the rigging. And I still have this idea of somehow building the island separately, with the boats, with the funnels, with the bridges, with the masts, with everything, and then installing the whole sub-assembly, the whole island, with all the connected pieces on the hull. I don't know. I could see in the manual that for this model Hobby Boss installs the propellers and rudders in step 2 or 3 or something like this, the very beginning of the build. So remember, in the Cesarewitch, in the Trumpeters Cesarewitch, we had to install, they said we should install those at the very end of the build, which was kinda crazy, I mean, even for me. But no, these guys came back to put the rudders and everything while the hull is empty. You can put the hull upside down and install the pieces properly. And I'm also tempted to do something in the very beginning about the turrets and about the guns, because for this model the turrets and the guns are assembled and installed towards the end of the build. So I don't know what I'm gonna do with that. I don't know. First of all, I don't know what I'm gonna do about the island. Do I want to respect whatever trumpeter, whatever Hobby Boss tells us in the instructions, or do I want to assemble the island separately? I guess we'll have to see. First of all, we'll have to proceed with 1 or even 2 episodes with the box opening and some other questions and the color scheme. Yes, very interesting. Thank you for watching.